Sri Ramana Paravidyopanishad, the supreme science of the self as taught by Sri Ramana. The existence of their own self is inferred by some from mental reasoning, by the reasoning, I think, therefore I am. These men are like those dull-witted ones who ignore the elephant when it goes past and become convinced afterwards by looking at the footprints. Indeed, everyone experiences his own existence during deep sleep, where the mind is absent. Also, the sleeper manifests remembrance of the happiness of sleep, saying, I slept happily. How can anyone remember the happiness experienced by someone else? The happiness of sleep was surely enjoyed by oneself. Does anyone say, he that existed prior to sleep is not the same person as I am now? As Bhagavan himself has pointed out, when Johnson goes to sleep, Benson does not awake, but only Johnson. The mind, along with the universe, merges in it, the self, in deep sleep, and from there it rises again, along with the universe, on waking. Hence, the creed of the void is untrue. Without a supporting substratum, how can the two, the universe and the mind, appear at all? Is there anyone who sees the serpent without its bases, the rope, or one who sees silver without its bases, the oyster shell? Surely there does exist a reality consciousness that lends an appearance of existence and shining to the universe, including the mind. How else can worldly people have the notion that this unreality exists and shines? Because these two shine only by the light of the self, therefore, that one is self-shining consciousness. Apart from that self, there is nothing else anywhere which is self-shining. When the real self shines on the dawn of right awareness, neither the sun, nor the moon, nor the stars shine. By its light alone do these shine. Here for the ignorant one, whose mind is turned outwards. There is not the least doubt about the existence of the real self, because that same pure consciousness by which the whole world shines, and by whose light the mind becomes mind, is the self. Ignorance does not obstruct the awareness of I am, but only the awareness of the fact, I am awareness. Everyone, with the exception of those deluded by the scientific creed, knows of his own existence. The eternal, unchanging, ever-shining self persists continuously as the real through all the varying states. Superimposed on it, the substratum, the whole world shines. It is by borrowing the reality of this reality, which is perfect consciousness, that this world and the mind appear as real to all those whose minds are deluded on account of their ignorance of their own selves. Bhagavan's own pronouncement is next quoted. Here is the utterance of the Most Holy One. Brahman, which is only one, itself shines inside, in the heart of all creatures as the real self, in the form of I. There is no other self. He also said, this same truth is the meaning of the utterance of the famous heavenly voice that told Moses, my real nature is just the consciousness I am. The sages, becoming aware of that which is Brahman, shining in the supreme state as the real self, are ever contented. It is as if they have had all their desires fulfilled simultaneously. The perfect happiness in which the sages live is inexplicable in any other way. This pure consciousness, which is the real self, appears to the one who does not know himself as the world. This misunderstanding of the true nature of the real self is rooted in the ignorance of one's own self. This world, the outcome of ignorance, of course, conceals the truth of that self. The intellect, the senses, and the mind are the servants of that ignorance. Hence, it is that the worldly means of proof, namely direct perception, tradition, and inference, serve only to deceive the creature. They do not at all serve the attainment of right awareness. Where is the wonder that the ignorant, thinking the world to be real in its own right, also become persuaded that the real self, which is ever blissful, desireless, unrelated to anything, and alone, is in bondage to the worldliness? The unreality of the world, which has thus been expounded, is not easy to understand by the aid of the one single simile. Hence, to make this intelligible to the sadhaka, the Holy Guru gives 3 similes in succession. When it is explained that the illusory appearance of the world is like that of the serpent in the rope, a doubt occurs to the disciple because he thinks that the simile does not apply in all cases. The illusory notion of the serpent ceases when the rope is known to be the truth. The world illusion does not cease for the aspirant when he understands that it is unreal. Even after the truth of the unreality of the world is known, by the help of revelation and by arguments, still the world continues to appear as if real. There is an explanation of this apparent anomaly which is given next. The world illusion does not come to an end by theoretical knowledge, and hence there is no room for this doubt. Yet, in order to remove this doubt, the Guru gives a second simile. Even after the truth of it becomes known, there persists the vision of water in the mirage. But even when this doubt is cleared, another doubt arises in its place. It is objected, worldly objects serve some useful purposes, but the water of the mirage does not. To this, the reply is, things seen in a dream are useful in the dream, but all the same, they are unreal. In the same way, the objects of the world, though useful, while they appear to exist, are unreal. This state, called waking, is really a dream seen by the creature who is a victim of a sleep that consists of ignorance of the real self. As long as this sleep of ignorance does not cease by direct experience of the truth of the self, this dream called waking, wherein the world appears as real, will continue. It must be understood that reality is freedom from being contradicted, and unreality is being subject to extinction. The self alone is real because it never ceases to be. The world is unreal because it ceases to appear when there is awareness of the self. The nature of the world's unreality is next further clarified. The whole universe appears as a superimposition on the real self, the substratum, which is the reality, and hence it is not like a man's horn, but it is taught that it is not real in its own right. This distinction is important. There are two kinds of unreality: the utterly unreal, which is never conceivable as real, is one which has no substratum, like a man's or hare's horn. The other kind is that which can and does appear as real, like the rope snake, the world's unreality is of the latter kind. It is not real in its own right, since it owes its appearance of reality to its substratum. This point will be dealt with later. So far, the question of the reality of the world as a whole has been discussed, and the conclusion has been reached as stated above. Bhagavan next deals with the same question in detail and thus confirms this conclusion. This whole world appears divided up into an endless variety of parts. Our holy Guru makes it clear that all these parts also are unreal when taken separately. It is the mind that knows the difference between the individual soul and God and all other differences. It is the nature of the mind to perceive differences. In the mind-free state, there are no differences. Differences are perceived in waking and in dream, where the mind is present, not in deep sleep, nor in the supreme state, because there the mind is absent, as shown. This appearance of differences is next traced to its root, which is stated. Hence, the totality of all these differences experienced by the unwise exists only in the mind's perception. All the mind's perceptions have their root in the perception of the difference between the self and the non-self. This is the persuasion, I am this body, which is the root cause of the tree of samsara. And since this persuasion is declared to be ignorance, all differences are the outcome of ignorance. The mind, which is named the soul, itself creates and perceives these differences through ignorance. There are no differences in the state of deep sleep, and in the supreme state there are no differences. Specifically, the difference between God and the soul and all the rest. For this reason, all the pairs and the triads are unreal. They are non-existent in the natural state of the self, and the one that dwells in that state, the supreme state, is unaffected by them. The pairs are exemplified in the next two verses. The Master declares that all these listed items and any similar entities are unreal, like dreams, because their root cause is the ego sense, the difference of inside and outside, birth and death, the totality and the units, the creation and the dissolution of the world, darkness and light, the self and the not self, bondage and deliverance, knowledge and ignorance, the soul and God, free will and fate, pleasure and pain, bad and good qualities, and merits and sin. These are pairs of opposites called dvandvas. The triads, triputis, are discussed next. The knower, the objects of his knowledge, which are non-self, and his knowledge of objects, and everything else that similarly comprises these three factors are said to be unreal, like dream, because they are the outcome of ignorance. The world is found on scrutiny to consist of these pairs and triads. The first pair to be dealt with is that of the soul and God. The two, namely, those named the soul and God, which are created and projected on the real self by ignorance, are not different from each other. This difference is perceived during the prevalence of ignorance, due to the identification with a form that is assumed to be real. Apart from the limitation imposed by the form, the two are the same. Maya is the body or attribute of God. Ignorance is that of the soul. Maya is subject to that Supreme One, but the soul is subject to ignorance. Maya and ignorance are mentioned in the sacred lore in order to account for the difference between the soul and God. This difference, being rooted in the ignorance, is unreal, but it is regarded as real from the standpoint of worldly activities. Duality will continue to appear to be real so long as this quality of being a soul does not cease by right awareness of the self. For this reason, this difference will appear as real, just like all other differences here. The unreality of the three, namely the world, God, and the soul, is taught as a single indivisible truth. It is not possible to use one half of a hen for cooking and the other half for laying eggs. The analogy is to impress the truth taught here, that the three mentioned are real or unreal as one whole and not separately. So the teaching of their unreality cannot be accepted in regard to one and rejected for the other two. For the one who regards himself as the owner or dweller in the body, as being a soul, the real self himself becomes God. Such a one should practice devotion to him for the sake of deliverance. This need for devotion exists even for an Advaitin, a believer in non-difference, as is shown below. such a one who knows the truth of non-difference by the intellect alone, but is unable to achieve experience of the true nature of the real self, must strive to attain deliverance by devotion and self-surrender to God. There are two paths prescribed because of a difference in qualifications. Only two paths are laid down for the aspirant to deliverance. For the valiant, the quest of one's own self, and for the fearful, self-surrender to God. In these two, all the paths are included. A great many paths are known and followed, but all come under these two. The valiant one has been already described. The other is the one who is afraid of samsara, but is unable to take to the quest taught by Bhagavan as being the direct path. On this direct path, all preconceived notions are dropped, as will be seen. Self-surrender is the final step in the practice of devotion to God, which is the only other alternative to the direct path. This twofold path has been taught by the Most Holy One Ramana thus: either seek the root of the ego sense, the I that rises within the body, or surrender that ego sense to God to have it destroyed by His grace. That foolish man who, considering himself as an Advaitin, but not being valiant enough to take to the quest as taught by Bhagavan, and who looks down upon devotion as inferior, lives in vain without devotion to God. He is a man with a tainted mind. In the samsara, the devotee is like a pot let down into a well with a rope tied to it. The man without devotion is like a pot fallen into the well without a rope being tied to it. The meaning is that the devotee is destined to be rescued from samsara by God's grace, but not so those who have no devotion. The path of devotion is dealt with next. Those who are endowed with the diabolic temperament cannot have the right kind of devotion. Hence, the good one should take hold of the divine temperament for practicing devotion to God. The power of God, well known in the world as grace, has three forms: God, the Supreme Being, the Holy Guru, and the real self in the Supreme State. These three are thus declared to be one. Devotion to God leads to the finding of the Guru, who is God Himself. Devotion to the Guru leads on to right awareness of the Self, which is none other than God. This grace of God is merely the fact that He Himself is present in the heart as the real self. Grace is the very nature of that Supreme One. and without grace, he can have no existence. That grace of God is ever wide awake. There is never a time when that grace is absent. But so long as man's ego sense is alive, he needs effort on his part. That grace of God will not desert anyone. She will surely lead all to deliverance. Some will be delivered soon, others after a long time. The devotee may think, I am practicing devotion to God by my own efforts, but this is not true, because it is God who pursues the deluded soul, who wanders blindly in the forest of samsara and takes hold of him by his grace. The extent of God's grace is so much. He gives himself to devotees, for when by his grace the ego is destroyed, the aspirant obtains the state of not being different from him. God is that kind of magnetic mountain which draws the souls to himself, makes them motionless, and consumes them like food, and ever after safeguards them in the supreme state, endless bliss, which is his own state. This truth is set forth in the 6th and 11th verses of one of Bhagavan's hymns to Sri Arunachala, Arunachala Dashakam. All souls are destined to reach this goal by divine grace. This is described in the next verses, whose theme is taken from the 8th verse of Bhagavan's Arunachala Ashtakam. As the river, born from the rains of the clouds that rise from the sea, returns to its source, the sea, and as the bird, wandering a long time in the sky, obtains rest by returning to its home on earth, so the soul, which has originated in the Supreme One, after wandering in the samsara for an immense period of time, returns in the reverse direction and rejoins that Supreme One from where it originated. Om Namah Bhagavate Sri Arunachala Ramanaya.